The cultural factor. In the judgment of a well known Muslim congressman, the partition of India was due mainly to the forces of cultural separatism. The theme of this chapter is to consider the role of culture in the making of Muslim nationalism and to see how far it contributed to the feeling of separatism among Indian Muslims. Culture and nationalism. A culture, in the words of Sir Ernest Barker, is a mental construction. It lives in the minds of men and molds their way of thinking, their way of life, and their character. It may not always be possible to define what a culture is or even to portray the lineaments of a particular culture. But we all know what it means to belong to a particular cultural group and how this belonging distinguishes us from those who live in a different cultural milieu. In this sense, culture is probably the greatest determinant of a nation. A nation may have two or more religions, many languages may be current within it, there may be no racial homogeneity in the national group, but sooner or later a nation is bound to evolve a culture of its own, which will be distinct and definite even if it is nothing but a mixture of cultural traits borrowed from other cultures. The United States and Canada are good examples of this. Culture has a respectable antiquity, and we find fully grown up cultures at times when the concept of nation had entered neither the mind nor the vocabulary of man. In the 14th century BC, Hellas was already a culture. At least Isocrates thought so. Within 100 years, a common Hellenistic culture flourished throughout Egypt and Western Asia. And the Byzantine Empire later became its outward symbol. Rome too was a culture long before it was a nation, if a nation it ever was. The point of the argument is that culture is a concept which belongs to the sphere of the mind. When a man thinks that he belongs to a culture group, one cannot argue with him, as one can when religion or language or race is in question. When many people begin to feel that they have a common culture, they are already on their way to becoming a nation. Generally, there is nothing which serves as a nation nexus more effectively than culture. In India, however, religion had precedence over culture. But here, too, the culture itself was based on religion. The Indian Muslims claimed that their culture was different because it was a Muslim culture. There is no place to distinguish between Muslim culture and Islamic culture or to argue Islamic culture. What is asserted here is that Indian Muslims had, broadly speaking, one culture and they chose to call it Muslim culture because its distinctive character was based on Islam. One strong argument in favor of this is the fact that when an Indian changed his religion and was converted to Islam, he immediately changed his cultural allegiance. Hindu or Christian converts to Islam then belonged to a distinct cultural group, which they found to be as different from other cultures as was Islam from other religions. In India, there was no Christian culture or Sikh culture or Parsi culture, but there was definitely a Hindu culture, ancient and well established, with which the invading Muslims had clashed. As the background, content, and contours of the two cultures were so different, their adherents never evolved a common society. The cultural differences were in fact at the root of separatism. The gulf was too deep to be bridged and too wide to be crossed. The two cultures stood side by side, adamant, exigent, and inexorable. They met only on the field of battle. In the event, cultural separatism divided the country, so that each of the two cultures, which could not live together in harmony, may flourish in its own dwelling place. This is one way, the cultural way of interpreting the genesis of Muslim nationalism. The following pages are meant to examine the validity or otherwise of this interpretation. Cultural bodies precede political bodies. In India, cultural bodies were established long before political organizations came to life. In Muslim India, The Muslim League was preceded by the Muhammadan Educational Conference. In Hindu India, the National Congress came much later than the Brahmo Samaj. This is a phenomenon common to many countries. In South Africa, the broader bond was primarily a cultural organization, and it was only in 1933 that it began to widen its sphere and gradually embrace the Nationalist Party's creed. In Ghana, the Convention People's Party was preceded by the West African National Congress. In Nigeria, the Action Group was the child of Egbe Omo Oduduwo, a Yoruba cultural organization, and the Northern People's Congress was an offspring of the Jamia, a Hausa cultural society. One of the earliest actions of Sayyid Ahmad Khan in the way of educational regeneration was the establishment of a translation society and a scientific society. The former aimed at acquainting the non-English knowing Muslims with works of European and particularly English literature and philosophy by translating them into Urdu. The latter was meant to encourage the study of pure science and other technical subjects. Later, the Muhammadan Anglo-Oriental College was founded at Aligarh to impact enlightened education to the Muslims enlightenment because it was a nice balance of Eastern culture and Western learning. The foundation of the Aligarh College turned out to be more than just the establishment of an educational institution. It gave birth to the famous Aligarh movement, which was partly educational, partly literary, partly religious, and wholly cultural. It set new targets in education, new standards in literary composition and criticism, new ideals in social thinking, and new norms in Islamic exegesis. It was a social movement and preached the gospel of the good life in the Aristotelian sense. It is impossible to exaggerate the role of this movement in the cultural regeneration of Muslim India. Sayyid Ahmad's sagacity saw that a strong cultural base must be built before an enduring political fabric could be erected upon it. Politics were for the time being forgotten and all energies were directed towards the development of education, language, literature, and social uplift. The idea was that when once the Muslims had adequately advanced in the realm of mind, a national feeling would follow as surely as days follows the night. Subsequent history showed that this was the right course, and had the Muslim League been formed in say 1870 or 1880, it would have been built on sand, for political unity is but a delusive hope without prior cultural homogeneity. Moreover, the Aligarh movement in the sphere of education not only produced public men who later took to politics, but also inculcated some discipline in the mass of men. It is not always possible to identify a nation with a language group. The examples of Canada, Switzerland, and Belgium are well known. When the peace treaties of 1919 were being framed and the Wilsonian principle of self-determination was being translated into reality, it was generally taken for granted that language was sufficient basis for common nationality, and several states were created on the premise. But this assumption was proved false in some cases when plebiscites were held to ascertain the popular will. Some Slavs like Mousterians in East Prussia and some Slovenes in Carinthia were opposed to their inclusion in Slav states and wanted to be parts of the German-speaking Germany or Austria. The German-speaking people of Oldenburg, on the other hand, voted in favor of joining Hungary. In some cases, the creators of the peace treaties themselves did not take language as their test of nationality. The German-speaking population of Austria and northern Bohemia were not permitted to join Germany. Language, therefore, is not a fundamental characteristic of a nation. It is not the essence of the nation, as some people claim it to be. But language still remains one of the features by which a nation may be distinguished, or one of the grounds on which nationalism may be founded. There is always an affinity between people speaking the same language. Language affects literature, and literature affects national life. A language is made up of words, and words which we habitually use often mold our mode of thinking. Common words make for common thoughts and feelings. Language is primarily a vehicle of communication, and thoughts and feelings, when communicated through the same medium, tend to be stamped with a characteristic unity. This affinity easily leads to national unity because a nation is a tradition of thought and sentiment. India has traditionally been a paradise for philologists. Its several major languages, in addition to hundreds of dialects, have fascinated the foreigner as much as they have confused the native. In fact, one of the most potent arguments against there being one Indian nation was the bewildering variety of its languages. Urdu was, by general consent, considered to be the language of the Muslims. Born under the Mughals by a combination of Persian, the court language, and some indigenous Hindu dialects, it grew up in times of political and cultural stress. Many Hindus used it, and some find Urdu poetry has been written by them, but emotionally they always distrusted it. For this, there was a simple reason. The Hindus had their own language, Hindi, which leaned heavily on Sanskrit for its vocabulary. Urdu, on the other hand, borrowed more freely from Persian and Arabic, though some of its sweetest phrases came from Hindi. As political and cultural rivalry increased, the two languages began to fall apart. The supporters of Hindi claimed for it a national status. The Muslims hotly denied it. As the controversy spread, the two languages became more and more exclusive. Hindi was made pure by the progressive incorporation of Sanskrit words. The Urdu enthusiasts went more often to Persian and Arabic for vocabulary as well as syntax. Though Urdu was in its origin neither the language of the Muslims nor a Muslim language, it gradually became so. Soon it assumed a place in the tradition, second only to their religion. Thus, linguistic conflict added to Indian disunity and helped the formation of more than one nationalism. The more the Hindus laid stress on Hindi, the greater emphasis the Muslims put on Urdu. The Hindi-Urdu controversy was by now an integral part of the Hindu-Muslim question. The Muslim League adopted Urdu as its national language, and among its demands for safeguards there always appeared a reference to the protection of this language. The Congress, on the other hand, attached itself to Hindi with equal resolution. Later, when the Hindus discovered that Hindi was not acceptable to all as the lingua franca of India, they tried to cut the knot by avoiding the very names of Hindi and Urdu and by adopting the word Hindustani. But this was very perfunctory way of dealing with the question. Literally, Hindustani means the language of Hindustan. In fact, there was no such language in existence. People either spoke and wrote Hindi or they spoke and wrote Urdu. None spoke or wrote Hindustani. It was an imaginary language which did not exist and had never existed. But instead of saying so in clear terms, they invented a new language which no one used. The name chosen for it was itself unfortunate, for it could also be translated as a language of the Hindus, and most Muslims chose to interpret it in this way. When the Congress ministries were in power in the provinces, one of the major Muslim accusations against them was that Hindi was patronized, promoted and extended at the expense of Urdu. The association of the Vidya Mandir education scheme with the teaching of Hindi was one of the reasons for Muslim opposition to it. The Congress' insistence on the use of Hindi was also behind the fierce controversy about textbooks in Bombay. In Madras, the Congress chief minister ordered that the teaching of Hindi should be made compulsory. This was bitterly opposed by the Tamil and Telugu speaking population, who started a regular agitation leading to the arrest of nearly 1,000 persons. The Congress policy of imposing Hindi on the whole of India was, however, not unprecedented in modern history. Europe provides some comparable examples. A similar attitude was adopted by the Germans in Schleswig, Prussian, Poland, and Alsace-Lorraine, and by Magyars in Transylvania after 1918. It was followed by some of the new Central European nations. But this did not stop the Muslims from reacting adversely to the policy of the Congress. They now made the language issue paramount, and shortly afterwards, when the demand for Pakistan was formulated, it was categorically laid down that Urdu would be its national language. But even long before this, they had made Urdu one of the elements of Muslim culture in India and had called it the Muslim national language of India. But this claim cannot be accepted uncritically. If we go by figures, more people spoke Bengali than Urdu. As a mother tongue, even fewer adherents could be claimed by Urdu. It was not the mother tongue for, nor was it spoken generally in the Punjab, the northwest frontier province, Sindh and Balochistan. In fact, in all the Muslim majority areas which later formed Pakistan, each of these areas had its own regional language, which though not so well developed as Urdu, had some impressive literary achievements to its credit. Languages which had produced poets of the rank of Khushal Khan Khattak, Waris Shah, and Shah Abdul Latif could not be dismissed as mere dialects. Nor was Urdu understood, let alone spoken. In the rural areas of the Punjab and Sindh, strictly, therefore, Urdu could not rightfully claim the status of the national language of the Indian Muslims. There seem to have been three factors which propelled Urdu to the forefront and made it, despite what was said above, the national language. One was a purely negative reason. The Hindus disliked Urdu and wanted to replace it with Hindi. This was enough for many Muslims to rally to the cause of Urdu. Positively, Urdu was the most developed language among all the tongues spoken in Muslim areas. It possessed a not inconsiderable literature. In poetry, it was specially distinguished. Moreover, it was generally understood over vast areas. A Pathan or a Sindhi might not speak Urdu, but if there was a language other than his own which he could comprehend, it was Urdu. It is not far from the truth to say that Urdu was at least understood in all towns and cities of Muslim India. Thus, if a choice had to be made among the Muslim languages, Urdu easily came first. Finally, there was a national need for a separate language. The Muslims claimed to be a nation. A nation was usually supposed to have a language for its own. Therefore, the Muslims must have a language too. Without it, there would be no Muslim nationalism. In this sense, Urdu was taken up not only as a language but also a sentiment for cementing national unity and as a slogan with which to win a new country. Religion and education are the two most important parts of that spiritual superstructure, which is the essence of nationalism. An integrated system of education influences social ideas and develops national character. It is trite but true to say that those who control the schools command the destinies of the people. In this respect, education is the mother of politics and precedes or should precede it. It is a proof of Sayyid Ahmad Khan's wisdom that he saw the truth of this principle and insisted on a sound educational foundation before entering the whirlpool of politics. As in other fields, so in education, Muslim ideals differed from those of the Hindus. Generalizations are notoriously fragile, but it can be affirmed that on the whole Muslims were less quick than the Hindus to pick up new ideas and more opposed to Western methods and content of education. During the post-mutiny period, Muslim conservatism kept them away from government schools and colleges. Muslim parents distrusted the newfangled theories of education and were content to send their children to the traditional maktab and madrasa, where the curriculum was rigidly confined to religious teaching and at some places rudimentary arithmetic and history and geography. The Muslims did not take to the English language and thus denied themselves opportunities of material as well as intellectual progress. Material because government jobs were open only to English knowing persons. Intellectual because the entire corpus of Western knowledge and learning was shut out from them. It is usually said that Indian nationalism was brought up on the writings of Burke, Mill and Paine. But this was not true of Muslim nationalism in its earlier stages. And that is partly why the latter did not appear till quite late. Not till the Western oriented education imparted at Aligarh had permeated through the Muslim mind. The role of what we may call educational nationalism in Muslim India can be best suited in the history of the Aligarh University. One of the functions of a modern university is to raise the level of participation of the educated people in the creation and growth of the nationality. It aims at promoting the development of knowledge within its own national culture society. These are the nationalistic functions of a university, and historically they are exemplified by French and German universities. At the beginning of the 20th century, in India, they are exemplified by the creation and functions of the Muslim University at Aligarh and the Hindu University at Benares. The former was the development of the Muhammadan Anglo-Oriental College founded by Sayyid Ahmad Khan, as the latter was an extension of the Central Hindu College promoted by Mrs. Annie Besant. It took the Muslims nearly 50 years to get the Aligarh College elevated to the status of a university. The struggle was hard and long, partly because of monetary difficulties and partly because of a conflict with the government on the issue of academic autonomy. This is not the place to describe the history of the growth of the university, but the point we want to make is that the Muslim community felt insecure, educationally naked, without the university of their own. They realized the importance of having their own educational center under their own control, which could enshrine their educational and spiritual ideals, and which could raise the level of their knowledge on their own lines. This Aligarh did for many years, and the depth of Muslim nationalism to it is great and deep. Aligarh was a symbol of Muslim nationalism in the fields of education and learning, but it was not the only symbol, though it was the most important. In Hyderabad, Deccan was established the Osmania University, whose contribution to Muslim awakening was of a different kind. It was the only center of higher learning in India which imparted knowledge in Urdu. Not only was the medium of instruction Urdu on all levels, but the university had also a large and well-staffed translation bureau, which made available in Urdu a great number of Western classics in literature, philosophy, science, history, politics, and economics. Many of the greatest European thinkers from Plato to T.H. Green were presented to the Urdu-knowing public in faithful translations. Philosophic and scientific technical terms current in the West were given Urdu equivalents, and thus an impressive scientific vocabulary was built up, which enabled the teachers to teach the natural and physical sciences in their own language up to the highest level. Besides the universities all over India were found Muslim colleges called varyingly Islamia colleges, Muslim colleges, MAO colleges, or Anglo-Arabic colleges. The Hindus had their own set of such institutions named Dayanand Anglo Vernacular colleges, Hindu colleges, Sanatan Dharam colleges, or colleges named after individual patrons. Basically, these colleges had the same curricula and courses of study, for all of them were affiliated to undenominational universities. But their teaching staff and the student body were almost exclusively Muslim or Hindu. In some cities, Muslims formed societies or associations to establish and run schools and colleges, e.g. the Anjuman-e-Himayat-e-Islam in Lahore and the Anjuman Islamia in Bombay. They ran chains of schools and colleges. As was said earlier, Muslims were slow in taking advantage of educational opportunities. This can be accounted for on three grounds. In the first place, there was the inertia of the post-mutiny period, when attachment to traditional modes had kept them away from the new enlightenment, which came with Macaulay's theory and ideas. In the second place, they were a poor people and could neither afford to build their own schools nor bear the expense of sending their children to government institutions. In the third place, their ideas of education based on Islamic foundations clashed with the then prevailing conception of a secular system of instruction. This needs some elaboration. British official policy in India was one of complete impartiality in religious matters. The government gave full religious freedom to all creeds and consistent with public order. In the educational sphere, this attitude excluded religious instruction in schools and colleges. The Hindus did not much object to it, but the Muslims did. In consequence, the government schools were felt to be inadequate or downright unsuitable for the Muslim youth. They insisted on a course of Islamic teachings as one of the essential ingredients of the education of a Muslim boy. When this was not forthcoming, they resented a foreign system of education which was secular and therefore un-Islamic. Another source of dissatisfaction to the Muslims was that the British imposed system of education did not make any concessions either to their traditional values of learning or to their cultural background. They felt a deep loyalty to Arabic, the language of their holy book, and to Persian, the language of their culture and the mother of Urdu. Oriental learning in general was also dear to them. But these were either ignored or given insufficient scope in the official scheme of public instruction. Oriental classics found no place in the curricula. Oriental faculties did not exist in any college or university in the earlier years. For some time, Muslim colleges were ineligible for affiliation to universities. The tardy and sluggish growth of Muslim nationalism was in great part due to a lack of educational progress. Conservatism, poverty, and attachment to traditional and partly outmoded values slowed down the tempo of advance. The results were unhappy, literacy was slow, higher education was of poor quality, schools and colleges were neither adequate to the needs of the Muslims nor good enough for the standards demanded of them. Some Muslim areas suffered badly. When Pakistan was created, there was no university in the frontier province or in Sindh or in Baluchistan. Sindh and Baluchistan had a negligible number of colleges. The University of Dhaka was not established till after 1912. Such lack of opportunity as well as of interest was a stumbling block in the way of national solidarity. Political awakening follows educational awakening, and national unity is difficult, if not possible, in the absence of a well spread education. This handicap was, however, partly compensated by one negative factor: Hindu opposition to Muslim educational aspirations and plans, and Hindu insistence on implementing their own schemes throughout India were instrumental in uniting the Muslims to an extent unwarranted by their disunion and dissensions. The Hindus were against the establishment of a Muslim university at Aligarh, professedly on the ground of national unity. If denominational educational institutions were permitted to exist and multiply, they said Indian national unity would be jeopardized. They stood for secularism in education as well as in politics. To this, the Muslim replied that the Hindu opposition was not innocent of vested interest. The Hindu did not want to see the Muslim progressing in the educational sphere and desired to suppress them culturally. He supported this argument by pointing to the foundation of a Hindu university at Benares and to Hindu opposition to the creation of a university at Dhaka. In 1939, at its 52nd session held at Calcutta, the All India Mohammedan Educational Conference, completely non-political and had no liaison with the appointed a, appointed a committee to examine the entire educational field in India and to prepare a scheme for Muslim education with a view to the preservation of the distinctive features of their cultural and social order. Nawab Kamal Yar Jung was the chairman of this committee, which consisted of some distinguished educationalists. The main work was done by a subcommittee headed by Sir Azizul Haq, then the Speaker of the Bengal Legislative Assembly and Vice Chancellor of the University of Calcutta, and later a member of the Viceroy's Executive Council, and still later High Commissioner for India in London. The committee published its report in the spring of 1942. The picture it depicted of the position and prospects of Muslim education was indeed dismal and gloomy. The proportion of Muslim students in all institutions was low. Muslim studies figured poorly in the courses of study. High research in Muslim history and culture was negligible. In primary and secondary education, Muslim and Urdu schools were being closed down or strangled by niggardly grants and aid. One full chapter of the report dealt with the Varda scheme of education which Gandhi had drawn up and which the Congress governments had been implementing in the provinces. This said the report was an essentially communal scheme shot through and through with Hindu ideals. The teaching of religion was completely ignored, and this amounted to an attempt to disengage the Muslim child from his faith. Muslim children were obliged to honor the Congress flag, to sing the Bande Mataram, to wear homespun cloth, and to do the puja to Gandhi's portrait. It was in the central provinces that the Varda scheme appeared in its most orthodox and obnoxious form. This was the Vidya Mandir, the creation of temples of learning. In the provincial legislature and all over the province, Muslims had bitterly opposed the introduction of this plan, but their resentment was unheeded. When the bill relating to the scheme came before the assembly, it was opposed by every single Muslim member and also by a few Hindus. including the former Chief Minister Dr. Khare, but it was carried through by the weight of Congress votes. Under this scheme, schools were to be managed by committees chosen by a joint electorate. No separate Muslim schools were provided, nor were arrangements made for training Urdu speaking teachers. The very name Vidya Mandir was a challenge to the Muslims, for it smacked of Hindu idolatry. In a brilliant note appended to the report by Sir Aziz ul Haq occurred the following paragraph: either the present system of school and university studies must have such syllabuses and themes that the Hindus, the Muslims, and all other creeds and communities can meet on an essentially common platform with no influence, tendency, or bias in favor of the one or the other. For educational India must be a federation of two or more distinct types of educational organizations, each trying to develop its own culture and heredity, but in a spirit of Catholicity and goodwill to others. I do hope and pray that wisdom and sense will still prevail and there will be a common and united plan and program of education. Thus, in culture too, as in politics, separatism was invading the Muslim mind. More than anything else, it is literature which reflects the contours of cultural nationalism. That is so because it enshrines in itself the thoughts and ideas, the history and language, the art and character of the people who have produced it. It is only by acquainting ourselves with their literature that we know so much about the cultures of past ages. In India, there was no dichotomy of Hindu and Muslim literature. There was an ancient Hindu literature, but no such thing existed in modern India. Similarly, there was a body of literature in the world which could be called Islamic literature. But in India, no such title could be given to the literature produced by Muslims. The distinction was more subtle. The Muslims' literary production was of a different nature and had a different background and was inspired by different sources. Three sources of the literature of Muslim India may be identified. One was religion. Many writings were religious in character without being theological. Religious poetry is an example. The second was history. The Muslim past in India or elsewhere was a theme of innumerable poems, novels, essays, and even plays. The third was a pervasive influence of Persian and Arabic cultures. A Muslim boy's education was considered to be incomplete without a fair grounding in Persian literature. Old-style gentlemen could recite thousands of lines from poets like Sadi and Hafiz, and the traditional idea of the culture, Persian and Arabic, had precisely the same position which was held by the classics in the education of a cultured Englishman in the 19th century. This inevitably left its mark on literature. It was in this sense that what we may call, for the lack of a proper name, the literature of Muslim India differed from the literature of the rest of India. As most of this literature was produced in the Urdu language, we will here refer to it as Urdu literature, though we must bear in mind that several Hindus, a few of them eminent in their field, contributed to it. The religious content of Urdu literature was not much. It contained a body of religious poems mainly in praise of God and the Prophet, and one major item, the Shahnama-e-Islam, a long epic by Hafiz Jalandhari, soothing in its mellifluous and liquid rhythm and very more moving for Muslim readers, but of no great poetic merit. The historical content was considerable both in poetry and in prose. Many poems, like several of Iqbal's, are incomprehensible without a good knowledge of Islamic history. Allusions to minor events and incidents of this history abundant, and the ability to understand them was taken for granted. In prose too, historical works glorified the victors of Islam. Biographies of Muslim heroes were popular, with Shibli's 6-volume biography of the Prophet was the crown of achievement in this genre. Historical fiction was not much in evidence, but the little that was avidly read by the semi-educated, particularly by women. Literary skill was not their forte, but they appealed to the raw imagination of the newly awakened masses and so accelerated the growth of national consciousness. The most prominent characteristic of Urdu literature was the color it took from Persian literary and cultural heritage. Urdu poetry borrowed in its sanction from Arabic and most of its metaphors from Persian. No poet worth his salt could be ignorant of these two languages, and some grounding in them was essential even for appreciating Urdu poetry. Furthermore, some Urdu poets wrote both in Urdu and Persian, and literary critics agree that in some cases the Persian work is superior to the Urdu. Iqbal is the outstanding example. Ghalib too wrote well in Persian. Even among minor poets, it was not an uncommon practice to scatter Persian verses among their poems, which made their work unintelligible to those who knew no Persian. This shows how deeply Urdu literature was attached to and grounded in Islam, Islamic history, and Persian and Arabic cultures. This made it essentially Muslim and therefore essentially different from the literature of the rest of India. The point is that Hindu and Muslim writers received their inspiration from different sources. The Hindu writer referred back to the time of glory under the Mauryas, Guptas, and Marathas. The Muslim looked back to the glorious days under the Grand Mughals and pinned his fate on pan-Islamism or panacea for the ills of the present. Their memories of a golden past was as much at variance as their dreams of a future utopia. Though there was a considerable body of Hindus and Muslims who enjoyed erotic Urdu poetry and whose hearts were deeply moved by the supple grace of a moment or the naughty wit of Dagh, yet the real spirit of Urdu literature remained alien to the Hindu mind, which could not share its cultural background. To accept a Hindu to understand and appreciate the bulk of Iqbal's work is like asking someone completely ignorant of Greek mythology and Christian lore to comprehend and enjoy Milton's Paradise Lost. Literature can be a cruelly divisive agent in a multicultural society, and it is exceedingly difficult either to suppress it or to submerge it completely in a different literary tradition. It was after a century and a half of Germanization that the ideal of Bohemian independence reappeared through the deliberate recreation of Czech culture. The process of Lithuanian national independence did not begin until the Lithuanian literary culture was revived in the second half of the 19th century. Literary groups and associations play an important part in the regeneration and progress of literature. What would French literature be without the Académie Française? Literary associations were formed in Canada for the purpose of promoting the growth of an original Canadian culture. The United States considered it necessary in 1904 to found the American Academy of Arts and Letters. In India, the Hindus, under the inspiration of the Nobel laureate Tagore, established the Shantiniketan, a sort of an academic center for the protection and promotion of Indian culture and literature. The Muslims founded the Anjuman-e-Taraqi Urdu at Hyderabad, Deccan. Soon it had branches all over India, and for a quarter of a century it did noble service to the cause of Urdu language and literature. Men of letters play no small role in nation making. They developed the language out of either a rough dialect or a mixture of two or more regional tongues. They record and collect literary gleanings, relate them to current myths and legends, translate treasures of traditional literatures, and synthesize the various cultural streams by writing the hitherto unwritten folklore. They modernize the language and keep it alive by constant borrowings from other tongues. They point out the deep relationship between literature and its historical inspiration. They relate poetry to patriotism and prose to national pride. The grammarians among them prepare dictionaries and lexicons, thus legislating on the meanings, nuances, and shades of words. They fix the usage of phrases, adopt new words, and evolve new figures of speech. All this was done in Muslim India by literatures of the calibre of Hali Shibli, Sayyid Ahmad Khan, Nazir Ahmad, Abdul Haq, Niaz, Fatehpuri, and others. Great stress was laid on the development of the language. The Urdu Bolo movement was initiated. Urdu literature was enriched by translations of Persian, Arabic, and European classics. The language was extended by such efforts as the publication of glossaries, preparation of technical terminologies, and coinage of new scientific terms. Even religion was nationalized by translating the Quran, rendering Arabic prayers, and writing sermons in Urdu. In short, the language was refined and polished by constant use and additions, and in the process, literature was inevitably enriched. Western parallels to this development are not hard to come by. French literature began in the 11th century with the Chansons de Geste, epic stories recounting the achievements of military heroes, and later with lyric poetry. At the beginning of the 14th century, Italian was accepted as the supreme common language of Italy, because much creative writing, culminating in the words of Dante, Petrarch, was being done in it. But the classical example of literary arts coming to the rescue of national integrity and awakening is that of a Norwegian literature which instigated the Norwegian people to liberate themselves from the centuries old cultural and social domination of the Danish national society. Three literary figures of Muslim India must be given special mention for the powerful impetus they gave to national consciousness. Syed Ahmad Khan's essays on social cum religious topics were published in his own journal Tehzeeb-ul Akhlaq, and their influence on social emancipation and religious liberalism cannot be exaggerated. Hali, a luminous star in the firmament of the Aligarh movement, not only acted as a Wordsworth of Urdu poetry by simplifying diction and glorifying nature, but also gave the literary world one of its masterpieces. The Musaddas, nothing like this had been written before. In sweet melancholy rhythm, he portrays the decline and fall of Islam in India and weeps over the misfortunes and miseries of his stricken compatriots. It is a dirge which moved the hearts and minds of men and did more than any other literary creation in opening their eyes to their perilous plight. This creative lamination ranks with those of few poems of the world which combine poetic merit of the highest order with a far-reaching practical utility. The last among these giants was Iqbal, who sang of the storied past with a lyricism which was strong in accent but soft in tone. He had a message to give, the message of Islamic brotherhood and Islamic purity, and gave it well without letting his muse degenerate into dull didacticism. His complaint to God about the plight of the Muslim is at times impudent and at times supplicatory, yet ever sincere. The general effect is neither of derisive howl nor of a cringing whimper, neither of gnashing of teeth in impotent rage nor of a maudlin emotion, but of a heartbreaking grief felt in the blood and felt all the way. What Syed had said in speech and prose, Hali put in measured stanzas, and Iqbal sang with the abandon of a Shelley. The combined assault on Muslim ignorance, apathy, and conservatism was shattering. From a defeated and demoralized rabble, Syed lifted his people and made them conscious of their identity. When Hali bemoaned their backwardness and offered a prayer for their salvation, he deepened their sense of guilt but also intensified the resolve to catch up with the times. Iqbal turned a minority already half conscious of its destiny into a solid group. Mentally, the soil had been well ploughed by these intellectual giants. It now waited for the statesman who had the vision to look into the future and the strength to make the people look with him. So when Jinnah arrived with his clarion call of a separate national state, people welcomed him as a long sought for deliverer, the liberator of the oppressed whom divinity had sent in answer to their prayers. Philosophy. Every nationality has its own philosophy, which may be a collection of certain definite philosophic teachings of the past or a body of philosophical ideas expounded by modern thinkers. Philosophy is not essential to nationalism in the sense in which, for example, language is, but it performs a necessary function. It gives ballast to the national idea, to the ideology. In India, the Hindus looked to their own ancient philosophy just as the Muslims traced their intellectual ancestry to Muslim thinkers like Avicenna and Al-Ghazali. When the Hindu was contemplating his past, he thought of Kautilya, the author of Artha Shastra. When the Muslim looked back, he recalled Al-Farabi. The philosophic past of the two peoples was so different as to obliterate any prevailing community of thought. In the modern age, again, this dichotomy ran right through the country. The Hindus' inspiration came from Radha Krishnan. The Muslims from Iqbal. Radha Krishna's Hindu view of life had has as much in common with Iqbal's lectures on the reconstruction of religious thought in Islam as navigation has with playwriting. Even if India had, by the play of historical forces, continued to be politically one country, her Muslims would never have considered Radha Krishnan or Aurobindo as a mouthpiece of their ideas, just as her Hindus would never have looked to Iqbal or Shah Waliullah as the fount of their philosophy. The influence of intellectual leaders on the history of nationalism should not be underestimated. Politicians come afterwards and build on the soil prepared by thinkers and writers. The emergence of Hindu or Indian nationalism was from the very first influenced by intellectuals who compared the history of Hindu civilization with the history of modern Western civilization and exalted the former. Gandhi was by no means the first to do so, but he is more typical example because he lived in the 20th century when the civilization of the West was known to the Orientals better than it was to their forefathers. In his opinion, Hindu civilization represented the highest spiritual values in contrast to the West's stress on materialism. In the same way, though not to that uncompromising extent, the Muslims looked back to Islam's golden age with nostalgia and frowned upon both the Hindu and the Western ways of life. Both Hindus and Muslims reacted unfavorably to the West, but there was one subtle and significant difference between the two approaches. The Hindu looked at the West not only with disapproval but also with hatred. Hatred always implies fear. We hate a man of whom we are secretly afraid. We have a contempt for a man whom we consider our inferior. To the Hindu, the West was an unknown entity, a completely foreign element, foreign to his past, to his country, and to his tradition. On the contrary, the Muslim looked with disfavor only at some aspects of the Western civilization. He did not reject everything Western, nor was his rejection so complete as thorough as the Hindus. People like Sayyid Ahmad could go to the extent of comparing English and Indians and calling the latter animals and brutes. In the desire to borrow the best features of the West and to combine them with those of Islam, these makers of the Indian Muslim Renaissance were reflecting the general opinion of Muslim India. Amir Ali, Chirag Ali, and others who came after them adopted the same line of thinking and did not allow their devotion to Islam to obliterate their wholesome respect for the virtues of the West. In political terms, the same idea may be expressed by saying that while Gandhi was, by his own confession, an orthodox Hindu who was opposed when even to such things as Western medicine and technology and who used Satyagraha as his political weapon, Jinnah was a modern constitutionalist who fought the British with their own liberal weapons. This contrast is not merely a superficial way of bringing out the difference between the mentalities of the two leaders. It goes deeper and reflects the essential, though partial, affinity between Islam and the West. Muslim India never, not even in the heat of the political battle, called the British or the civilization satanic, as Gandhi did. The explanation lies in the fact that Islam had behind it a history of centuries of contact with the West. It was through the Arabs that Greek philosophy and science had passed into Europe. In meeting the West, Islam had no fear of the unknown, the implacable enemy of confidence as well as courage. Art. In the aesthetic sphere too, different nationalities came to have an art of their own, or come to believe that the works of certain artists make up a national art. If art is an expression or manifestation of life and its values, its significance for the feeling of national solidarity needs no elaboration. In India, the Muslims looked to Mughal buildings as their artistic heritage. It was the Taj Mahal of Agra, or the Red Fort of Delhi, or the Royal Mosque at Lahore, which stirred their imagination, excited their pride. It was the art of miniature painting perfected in the court of Shah Jahan, which appealed to them. On the other hand, the Hindus were equally impressed and affected by the architecture of South Indian temples, the Rajput or Kangra schools of painting, or the Gandhara school, which was definitely Hindu in origin and nature. Every reader of Percy Brown's Islamic Architecture in India or Vincent Smith's A History of Fine Arts in India and Ceylon know how different was the Hindu art from the Muslims and how rarely the two mixed or merged. To a Muslim, a Hindu temple with its naked goddesses and phallic images was a positively distasteful sight. In fact, the anti-idolatry spirit of Islam was revolted by all kinds of Hindu architecture. The Hindu, on the other hand, saw most of the Muslim architecture enshrined in mosques and domes and minarets and mausolea, which carried upon them the clear impress of Islam and therefore could not be a part of his artistic world. There were a few buildings here and there which were secular in purpose or content and whose beauty was appreciated by both the peoples, but this rare coincidence could not make for a common artistic heritage. Conclusion. Thus, Hindu-Muslim conflict was not merely religious, it was a clash of two civilizations, of two peoples who had different languages, different literary roots, different ideas of education, different philosophical sources, and different concepts of art. Such a yawning cultural gulf was enough to destroy any affinity which the two peoples might have had and to bring to naught all efforts at unity. When this cultural variance was combined with diversity in social customs and modes of livelihood, the emergence of a united Indian nationalism was doomed without redemption.